Hi there, and welcome to Telefunken. Today's video is the first in our series on the vintage Roland CR-8000 analog drum machine. The CompuRhythm CR-8000 is a vintage analog drum machine first released in 1981. It sits between the CR-78 and the TR-808 in the pantheon of Roland drum machines and shares some features with both. Although less popular and less expensive today than either of its siblings, the CR-8000 offers a sound that some say approaches that of an 808 at a fraction of the price, and it has the benefit of being much easier to program and perform with than the CR-78. The CR-8000 has circuitry supporting 14 different instrument voices. However, 3 of these voices are effectively hidden from the programmer, and we'll have much more to say about that later on in this series. It has 3 banks of 8 for a total of 24 preset rhythms and offers 8 preset fill patterns. Its use in a performance context is facilitated by the so-called arranger section that allows the user to punch in and out of preset cymbal, hi-hat, clap, and conga accompaniments, and even has a shuffle function. Performance is further enriched by the use of 6 rotary potentiometers that control the mix of various groups of drum sounds. Programming the CR-8000 is facilitated by an interface that resembles that of the CR-78's optional accessory, the WS1. The 8000 has 8 programmable pattern slots and room for 4 programmed fill patterns. As the CR-8000 predates MIDI, it relies on DIN sync to keep time with other instruments, allowing for relatively painless integration into a modern studio setup, as it can either send or receive clock data at the standard Roland 24 pulses per quarter note. The instrument tempo, sent or received, is displayed quite prominently on the face of the instrument in a red LED display. This tempo display tracks to the incoming DIN sync, a useful feature that I'm sure many 808 owners would be envious of. Those of you who've seen our series on the CR-78 will know that it uses Intel's 8048 as the instrument's CPU. The CR-8000 uses a close relative of the 8048, the mask ROM encoded NEC microprocessor MUPD 8049C. It has double the RAM and ROM memory of the 8048 with 2 kilobytes 8-bit ROM mask programmed at the factory and 128 bytes of RAM. The CPU is encoded with one of 2 versions of software. The original C159 software contained a bug that was fixed in the later updated C232. As there's no mechanism for updating this firmware other than replacing the CPU, if you're purchasing a CR-8000 and have a choice, you might want to look for one with a later serial number, or simply open it up and confirm it has the 232 designation printed on the chip. The CR-8000 contains a second microprocessor, seen here peeking out from under the daughter board that houses the 3-digit tempo display mounted to the control PCB. This second processor, an 8048, is used to derive and display the tempo on the LED display. The microprocessor does all the work in this application, as there are no external binary decimal converters or LED driver chips used. With both the operating system and preset patterns stored in factory-coded mask ROM, the CR-8000 uses a single SRAM chip to manage the task of storing and accessing user patterns. The MUPD 444 has 4 times the memory of the chips used in the CR-78 and offers a number of practical advantages over the RAM configuration in the earlier instrument. First, the 444 draws 1/10 the current required to sustain the memory in the CR-78. However, it does require a maintenance voltage greater than 2 volts. This is provided by 3 disposable AA batteries mounted to a battery holder located on the underside of the instrument, well out of range of any of the printed circuit boards. As such, the CR-8000 is spared from the mayhem that results from PCB-mounted battery leakage, a syndrome that's ruined many CR-78s. That's not to say that the CR-8000 doesn't have its own set of issues. The CR-8000 is housed in a beige-colored ABS plastic case, similar in color to some of the first personal computers, including the Apple I, Apple II, Commodore VIC-20 and the 64, and the Amigas. The acrylonitrile butadiene styrene plastic becomes yellow over time, a spontaneous process due to oxidation catalyzed by the ultraviolet wavelengths present in sunlight, by heat, or by the two in combination. Contrary to popular folklore, this has nothing to do with the addition of bromine to the plastic formulation. The good news is that this discoloration is only skin deep and can be chemically reversed using hydrogen peroxide, ideally in combination with a booster and some more of that ultraviolet light, or, in a pinch, the plastic can be refreshed by polishing off the oxidized surface layer. The CR-8000 we're going to feature in this series suffers from this problem, and we'll attempt to address it later. A more serious challenge with the CR-8000 is that the momentary switches used in the instrument are prone to failure. There are 31 of these switches, made by Alps, that utilize a conductive rubber pad that presses down on two metal contacts to make a connection. These same switches are used in the TR-808 start-stop switch, the MC4, and of course the CR-5000. The failure mode is due to a combination of corrosion of the metal contacts and degradation of the conductive metal surface. At the time of this video, the original switches are unobtainable. An alternative replacement is to use switches developed for mechanical keyboards. However, this requires the use of adapter PCBs to fit the Roland PCBs in the drum machine. Even these may be hard to find. My advice to you is that if you have a Roland instrument with failing Alps switches, you attempt a repair similar to that described in this video series, because the results are well worth it. The CR-8000 went through a number of design revisions during its manufacturing run. For the most part, these modifications were made to address certain liabilities in the original design and improve the reliability of the instrument. There are some changes that affect the snare sound, however, with the latter instruments having a snare that's pitched higher than the first few hundred machines that left the factory. As great as the CR-8000 sounds in its native state, the voices are fixed, with no ability to adjust the sounds in the manner found on the 808 and later instruments. As a result, the CR-8000 has become a favorite of modders, and there are plenty of excellent examples found on the web where designers have taken advantage of the unused real estate on the top panel to incorporate adjustment potentiometers for the various drum sounds, in some cases even doing away with all of the preset and programming functions, using the CR-8000 instead as a platform for building a versatile, tunable analog drum module. The elephant in the room, however, is the lack of MIDI control in the CR-8000. Unlike the CR-78, which has a number of bespoke MIDI kits available designed specifically for it, the CR-8000 can be converted to MIDI, but only through the use of kits that are designed to be universal, i.e. work with several different analog drum machines, kits that by virtue of their more flexible design require some configuration to install and use in the CR-8000. We'll examine these and see if we can come up with a custom solution for this machine. As you'll see in the video that follows, our CR-8000 suffers from an array of issues in addition to those mentioned above. As is our pattern on this channel, we've taken in an instrument that's completely non-functional. When we started, I had no idea what was wrong with the instrument, but by the time we finished with our machine, we'll have it working better than it did the day it left the factory, and we'll have learned a lot and had some fun in the process. So come along for the ride in this first installment in this series as we introduce the CR-8000 and give it a visual inspection before we begin our diagnosis and repair. Join me for subsequent videos on rebuilding the power supply, fixing the momentary switches, design and installation of a MIDI kit, and calibration of the instrument. As always, thanks for watching. Well, we have here a Roland CompuRhythm CR-8000 on the bench, and this one is not working. And if we begin by examining it from the outside, we can see that it's seen better days. It has some spills on it. It has a plate here and a plate here that appear to have become slightly detached from the chassis. And if we move it from side to side, we hear some rattling of something that has come loose on the inside of the machine. This machine is billed as not working, and we'll set about diagnosing its failures. It has a UK power supply. Other than that, we don't know very much about its provenance. Somewhat strangely, the plate that is usually located right here on the back of the instrument has been removed or is absent. And that would normally give us the serial number, which could be quite helpful in terms of servicing this instrument, because the CR-8000 went through several revisions during its manufacturing run. In addition to the spills and the separation of these plates, we see as well that the chassis is really quite yellowed. And this is something that happens gradually over time through oxidation of the plastic. And we may see if we can correct that either chemically or mechanically. But in the meantime, we'll set about to open this instrument up and see what we can see on the inside and determine whether or not that's going to give us any hints as to what the failure might be. In addition to fixing this so that it works, we also want to convert it to a North American power standard. So rather than the 220, 240 volts that it would be expecting, we'll need to rebuild the power supply so that it can accept 110 or 120 volts AC, which is our standard here in North America. We don't know, for example, if the power supply in this instrument is even functioning. So it may be difficult to diagnose what's going on with the instrument until such time as we've rebuilt this power supply, so we know we're getting the appropriate voltages presented to the various boards. But regardless, let's open it up and see what we find. We have the CR-8000 opened up, and currently it's in two main pieces. We have the bottom half and the top half. But in reality, there are four main elements in this instrument. We have the CPU board, we have a power supply, we have a switch assembly, and then a voice and control board. The voice generator board and the switch assembly are attached to the plastic part of the chassis, and so I will detach these. That will require removal of the potentiometer nuts that are keeping the potentiometers attached to the chassis, and a number of screws, and very careful removal of the board through squeezing these little standoffs that are holding the switchboard to the actual chassis. So I'll set about doing that right now. Just going to point out that there are little non-conductive washers at this location here and here. And these are presumably to isolate the printed circuit board from the metal bracket on the instrument, which is beneath this board. That's the bracket right there that I was referring to. It may not have been necessary for me to remove all of these screws. I'll figure that out in a few moments. A certain amount of care is warranted here when trying to detach this board, because these standoffs can become very brittle. So give them a very gentle squeeze while prying up, again gently, on the printed circuit board to clear the board from the standoff. Do them one at a time, lest you actually break the plastic standoff, which does tend to become brittle over time. Modern replacements can be found for these, but you wouldn't want to have to source them unless absolutely necessary. And again, just the right amount of care and attention should free the board without any unnecessary stress. And don't forget, there's a standoff right in the middle here, hidden by these wires. And that was what's holding the board. There we go. And with these detached, we can now place these back on the main assembly and get a look at the inside of this chassis. We can see that it's seen better days. There's a couple of elements here that are broken right off. We're going to try and repair these, including some of these attachment points for the printed circuit board. So this will be getting a little bit of glue later on in this restoration. So I'll set this aside and we'll go from there. So we'll start our physical inspection with this switch control board. And one thing that we can see right away is that it has suffered from some liquid damage. I'm not sure if it shows up in the light right now, but there's a kind of a crystalline appearance all through this area, which looks almost like maybe crystallized sugar or something along those lines, almost as if there's been a can of Coke or something, 7-Up, that is spilled on the inside of this instrument, which of course wouldn't do it too terribly much good. Maybe it's not Coca-Cola because there's not a lot of rust or corrosion that's obvious in this area, unlike this area over here. In this area here, we do see quite a bit of corrosion. Again, this appears to be from liquid damage because it doesn't necessarily follow the traces on the board, so it doesn't appear to be the type of corrosion that might be electrochemical, say from a leaking capacitor or a leaking battery, that sort of thing. And of course, there's no battery attached directly to this board. This part of the assembly appears to be okay. The good news is, with respect to these two chips here, if they are damaged, and of course these diodes are damaged, these two logic chips are eminently replaceable, and we should be able to fix the corrosion and replace any wires that might need replacing through this area here. This, of course, is the board that displays the tempo. It's a little sub-assembly. I can't really see what's going on beneath there, but I don't see a tremendous amount of liquid damage here. Of course, all this will need to be cleaned, so the spotless, checked, working properly, switches will need to be cleaned, and so on and so forth. So that's one part of the restoration. Now, if we move on to the voice board, which is this board here, we see that although there does appear to be a little bit of grime on these potentiometers, which is to be expected given the amount of action that they've seen over the years, there does not appear to be any liquid damage, such as that which is on the switchboard. And so that's great news. There are a couple of chips on here that are difficult to replace, or not as easy as some to replace. But one of the things we may need to do is disassemble and clean these potentiometers. Although modern replacements can be found, what is very difficult to find is an accurate reproduction of these little orange inserts that go into these potentiometers. So we'll do our best to keep these and make sure they're working properly. Again, we have a couple of potentiometers, one for the accent, one for the main volume, and then a switch here. All of this stuff will need to be cleaned, various trim potentiometers. These trim potentiometers, which control the voices, will probably benefit from being replaced with multi-turn potentiometers, which I might do. Of course, all the electrolytic capacitors in this instrument will need to be replaced as part of the future-proofing process. So this is the CPU board, and this is our CPU right here, the 8049, relatively common chip, used in many different applications in addition to the various Roland instruments that it finds itself in. However, it is mask ROM programmed at the factory. So this is the D8049C232 chip, and this is the one that is going to be programmed with the programming required to make this instrument work. So we're going to be crossing our fingers and hoping that this particular chip is undamaged in spite of whatever failures may have befallen this instrument. Various other logic chips on this board, and it also houses the power supply, and the power comes in through this area here, where this houses a power transformer, which generates through two secondaries the power that comes in through this part of the board and is converted to a plus and minus 15 volt supply with a center tap on that secondary, and then there's another secondary winding that is converted to a 5 volt supply. There's two separate bridge rectifiers and independent filter capacitors and the like. We'll certainly be replacing all the electrolytic capacitors, all the filter capacitors, and so on. But the first thing we need to do is make sure that this power supply is actually functioning properly. That will be a little difficult given the fact that the transformer in this instrument currently is expecting 220 or 240 volts, and I don't have a 220 volt AC supply to test it. So one of the first things I'll do is probably detach the transformer from this board and evaluate the transformer's performance, and then do some voltage injections at various points on this board to see how the power supply is functioning. We can also detach the power supply from the voice board, and I believe these lines, or maybe it's these lines, I'm not sure, but I'll tell you later. We'll detach the power supply from the voice board as well to protect the voice board from any damage that might occur. We don't know when in time this instrument failed, and it may have failed with a fully functioning power supply, and yet over time other components in the instrument have reached their end of life. And so we want to be as careful as possible and mindful of the fact that we could introduce further damage to the instrument if we're not careful. And a few final observations as part of our initial inspection. And we see more corrosion here on the underside of the switch assembly, quite a bit of rust. Again, probably due to the liquid spillage, and we'll need to clean all of that up. We also see corrosion on the underside of the voice board, and this is in areas where there was no corrosion on the flip side. So I'm not sure I understand the genesis of this, but there's quite a bit of rust around this switch area, and then underneath here. Again, suggestive of a liquid spill, but how liquid would get on the inside of the instrument and the underside of this board without affecting the top side is beyond me. But nonetheless, that appears to be what has happened. So again, lots of cleaning, testing traces, making sure that they're intact, and conducting properly before we consider powering up these boards. So I think that's it for our initial visual inspection, and that now we'll develop an approach towards evaluating where the failures in this instrument might be. Well, that's all for this installment in our series of videos on the CR-8000. Our other videos feature rebuilding the power supply, refurbishment and repair of faulty momentary switches, design and installation of a MIDI kit, and calibration of the instrument. I hope you enjoy this series as much as I did making it, and as always, your comments, feedback, suggestions, and questions are most welcome. To all of you out there, take care, and thanks for watching.